Last night, I sat down with the search engine, which is certainly the ubiquitous tool of our age, and tried to determine what was the tenor of our times. I did this because I had recently had dinner with Jordan, who's a young entrepreneur, in the very neighborhood where I had once worked in Seattle. The neighborhood was very familiar. It was a place I knew well and frequented often. But Jordan asked, "Did you have any trouble finding this place?" And I kind of shrugged, saying, "I know this as well as anything." And of course, I didn't. Things had changed substantially since I was there. Oh, sure, many of the buildings were the same, but there were details that were different, a different class of people, and different kind of work that was being done in the old buildings along the waterfront. We might be tempted to identify the search algorithm as the marker of our time, but that would be a mistake. Search is a much older technology. It was commonly taught when I was a graduate student living in Seattle. It divides two very different ages from each other, the 1950s from the 1960s. The basic ideas were developed by H.P. Lunn of IBM. And he was very clear that he was trying to end an old way of organizing information and retrieving information. In his age, we organized material by taxonomies, categories that we used to file documents and books and other instruments of information, and then used them to retrieve those same documents later. These categories often had nothing to do with the words in the documents themselves, but they still simplified the process of storing and retrieving information. Lunn had the idea that you could use the words in the text to create new categories, and that when you combined these categories with Boolean logic and implemented them with mechanization, you could make the computer seem as if it were reading the documents themselves and presenting you with the ones that you wanted. He thoroughly killed taxonomies. Today, few people have ever seen them, and fewer still have used them seriously. So I went to the search engine to see what words stood out in our age and that were not commonly used before. Green, well, I suppose that wasn't surprising, as that was prominent in the 70s, was the first to leave the list. Sustainable went with it, as it proved to be more commonly used in earlier decades than it is now. Smart, as in smartphones, smart grid, smart technologies, smart cities, has been with us continuously through the 20th century and didn't seem to bubble up as being important. Agile, it's a word that seems very important to some, but not very important to much of the world. And that led me to innovative, or innovate, if you want to use the verb. Innovation is a word that's commonly associated with invention, though it means something quite different. In our modern sense, it involves looking at old things in new ways, and also introducing new products and services into the market in a destructive way, pushing old ideas out and building, one hopes, a broader and more inclusive market with the new idea. This word seems to mark our time. If you look in the IEEE Digital Library, you see that it was used commonly prior to 1998. But in roughly that year, its use began to grow and to grow rapidly. Indeed, it appears 5 times more frequently after 1998 than it did before. Now, of course, there are problems with this kind of analysis. The IEEE library does not search the text, but is looking at metadata. And the metadata was put in fairly recently by authors and editors who were trying to make sense of an article and not necessarily worry about its historical content. If you do a search on software engineering, you will find that the IEEE Electronic Library identifies papers from as early as 1917 as being on that subject, even though the term was not identified until nearly 50 years later. But if you go to other electronic libraries, you find much of the same pattern. And all of these libraries use slightly different search algorithms and slightly different ways of getting at the text. The ACM library seems to follow the exact same pattern as the IEEE library. So does the ProQuest Research Library. Even things such as JSTOR and Old Lady Gray herself, the New York Times. Some of my friends have suggested that in order to find the tenor of our times, I need to apply my methodology to the messages on Twitter or Facebook. They have a point, but I counter that these are new technologies and don't have a history. We can't compare the messages they once carried with those that they are carrying today. And besides, Jordan tells me that he is going to kill search, and he is going to kill it dead. He's been thinking about how to use machine learning to study the way we work, and to build taxonomies and structures for holding knowledge that's the way we want to hold them, even though we may not think of how to do that. His system may end up being the tenor of his times, or at least so we hope. But in the meantime, for our times, this is David Allen Greer for the Errant hashtag. Take care.